Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very grateful to the Newman Society and to Mystic Institute for the invitation to be here. I was indeed a student of philosophy here. In the previous millennium, that would be the same millennium as the one that Thomas Aquinas lived. So I won't tell you how long ago that is. Anyway, I'm here to talk about the virtue of charity. And before I do that, you have a little handout there. I want to briefly discuss, by way of introduction, 4 different models of love. Then I'll say a few words about charity as friendship, which is well covered in the literature. And then the triangular nature of charity, which I think is great fun. It describes how Thomas conceives of the Christian life and how charity completely transforms the way we relate to the world. I think it's really important. And following on from that, gratuity and non-instrumentality. Right, how much time do we have?
For however long you want, really. But
That's not the right answer, you don't? But between 40 minutes and 55 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Right, now, there are different understandings of Christian love. The main ones that you'll find in the literature are agape, which is a Greek word for love used in the New Testament, and eros, which goes back also to Plato. Now, agape is modeled on the love that God has for us. Now, that means that love is freely bestowed and independent of the needs of the lover and the merits and attraction of the beloved. So it is disinterested, universal, and non-preferential. That's the understanding of agape in traditional accounts. Love, understood as eros, on the other hand, is preferential. It involves a reference to the needs of the lover and is attracted by the positive qualities of the beloved. So it's not disinterested, it is not universal, it is preferential. So sexual love is obviously an exponent of eros, but even ordinary friendship is an exponent of eros. It means it's preferential. You love the girl with the brown hair and the green eyes, not the one with the dark hair or the blonde hair and the blue eyes, okay? It's preferential. Agape, on the other hand, is universal. According to universal love, you're supposed to love all people equally, no matter what they are like. And that's the way, allegedly, that God loves us. God loves all of us with a sort of freely bestowed love. And if there are certain qualities that are attractive in you, for instance, you're wise, you're clever, you're good looking, that's because God loves you. It's not that it's not the case that God loves you because you have those qualities, but you have those qualities because God loves you. So God's love is creative. It doesn't depend on the object of love. It's different with sexual love, eros, and friendship. Now, Christian love, if conceived as excessively agapeic, whereby the object and the qualities of the beloved are to be disregarded, is in danger, of course, of turning into indifference. I love all people, no matter what they like. Really and truly, I don't give a hoot about what they are like. So an extreme version of agapeic love is in danger of turning into indifference. On the other hand, if conceived as excessively erotic, it may become self-oriented and exclusivist. It's all about me and my needs, rather than about the other person. Now, aside from those 2 often discussed versions of love, there are 2 others that I would like to mention. They're mentioned there on your handout. The first one concerns the investment we make when we love someone. So here the idea is that it is exactly the time and the effort that we dedicate to someone that makes that person important to us. Have any of you read The Little Prince, Le Petit Prince? Okay, some of you are nodding. Good. What does the fox tell the little prince? It is the time you have invested in your rose that makes her important to you, right? There's lots of wisdom in that. Or think of a family where one child is disabled and needs an awful lot of time from the parents. Often it is that child that is actually the most loved because they put so much of their time and their life into that child, okay? So that's the investment theory of love. I'm not going to talk about that in any great detail. Thomas does have occasionally mentioned something like that, but it's not a major model. Then the fourth model we can call an eschatological model. Here we do not love the other person for whom she is now, but for whom she can become, even in the afterlife, right? To some extent, I actually think that's why parents love their newborn children. I mean, let's be brutally honest, they're not necessarily all that attractive, you know, screaming and they don't really respond initially and so on. But it's what the child will become. That is what makes them love their children madly. Now, Thomas's account of charity is usually interpreted in terms of Aristotelian friendship, and I'll be saying a few words about that in a minute, as a blend perhaps of the erotic and agapeic notions of love. But I think the eschatological element, which I've just mentioned, and the potential to share in eternal blessedness is equally important. Right. So let me say a few words about charity as friendship. When we talk about charity in a sort of post-Christian world, most people would say, oh, it has to do with the love for your neighbor, right? Make sure to get a handout. We usually interpret charity in terms of love of neighbor. That is not the primary meaning for Thomas. For Thomas, charity refers in the first place to the love that we have for God in response to the bestowal of his grace. And love of neighbor flows on from that love for God. Now, Thomas describes charity in terms of friendship with God, and he applies basically an Aristotelian model of friendship to Christian charity or Christian love. That's pretty well known in the literature as well, but still it is a rather surprising, even shocking thing to do. Why? Well, if you look at the qualities of friendship that Aristotle identifies, they include equality, mutuality, and having things in common. It's easier to be friends if you're on an equal level, so it's difficult to have real friendship between a master and a slave. There's too much inequality. You have to have things in common. You have to have common interests. That's a good foundation for friendship. There's got to be mutuality. It can't be just one-way traffic. So how can Thomas claim that any of those qualities apply to the relationship between humans and God? Because we're certainly not equal with God. And what do we have in common with God? So, Thomas argues that there is actually some kind of equality between God and ourselves thanks to the incarnation. And that's a beautiful idea. He writes, you don't have that quotation in your handout, but you can just listen. Since friendship consists in a certain equality, things greatly unequal seem unable to be coupled in friendship. Therefore, to get greater familiarity in friendship between humans and God, it was helpful for us that God became man, since even by nature, man is man's friend. And so, in this way, while we know God visibly, we may, through him, be born to love of things invisible. So what Thomas is saying, that thanks to the incarnation, the Son of God has become one of us, and therefore there is a measure of equality between ourselves and God. Another characteristic of friendship is having things in common. Now, what could we possibly have in common with God? We need some kind of fellowship. The word that Thomas uses is communicatio or societas, when he quotes 1 Corinthians 1:9. Having things in common. Now, what we have in common with God is, according to Thomas, beatitude or happiness, the happiness to which we are called in the afterlife. Now that, in a sense, already illustrates this emphasis upon charity and as sharing in the divine beatitude, illustrates the eschatological dimension of charity. So here and now, we can come to share in an incipient manner in the divine beatitude, in which we will fully participate in the afterlife. So this aspect will prove central, I think, to Thomas's account of charity, including the triangular nature of love, and the related question how it is possible to love our enemies. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next section, the triangular nature of love. I'll make a little drawing. So that's you, that's God, and that's others. That's basically what I'm going to try and explain. Can you love your enemy? Now, most of you are nodding because that's what you're supposed to be doing, if according to the Christian story. Thomas says, actually, no, you can't. Not outside the economy, if you like to use a theological word of charity. Let's be honest, I don't like my enemies, and they don't like me. Yes, I can perhaps sort of love them on a sort of general plane, and they share in the human nature, but let's not pretend otherwise, okay? I really dislike them, and I don't want to claim that I love them. And yet Christianity calls for a love of neighbor. How does that work, right? Okay, well, Thomas is going to try and explain this. Charity basically involves an ascending moment because charity is love for God, obviously in response to the free bestowal of God's grace. And then it entails a descending moment because from this love for God, a love of created things flows. There's question 27, article 4 from the second part of the Summa, where Thomas deals with the question whether God can be loved immediately in this life. And he offers a useful hint as to what the triangular understanding of love might be about. So Thomas says that our knowledge is derived from the senses, and those things are knowable first, which are nearer to our senses. I can know more about dogs and cats and flowers than I can know about angels or God, because God is very different. I can't perceive God, whereas I can see cats and dogs and whatever else, okay? So in a sense, he's very empirically minded. So how do we know something about God, aside from the scriptures, obviously? Through the senses, through the world. That's a key Thomist idea. With love, however, the starting point is God. And the dynamic of love flows on from God to things created, including then other people. So here you have a first quotation. Accordingly, we must assert that to love, which is an act of the appetitive power, that's the desire, even in this state of life, tends to God first, and flows on from him to other things. And in this sense, charity loves God immediately and other things through God. On the other hand, with regard to knowledge, it's the reverse, since we know God through other things. So, charity redirects, if you like, human love and desire. It immediately targets God and other things through God. Mediante is the word Thomas uses there in your handout. God is, in the language of Kierkegaard, who has exactly the same idea, God is the middle person between my love and others. Or as Thomas puts it, the medium. We love others through God or for the sake of God, which means exactly the same thing. So charity utterly transforms the way we relate to the world. With charity, we no longer love the world immediately, but through God as an intermediary. I will return to the objection, which is often raised, but misguided, that this instrumentalizes our love for others. So allegedly, if you love your neighbor for the sake of God, you do not love your neighbor in his or her own right, but only for God's sake. That is an objection that is often raised against this notion that we should love others for God's sake. And I will deal with that objection in some detail. So, our love of neighbor is an extension, if you like, of our love of God. And this has a realized eschatological dimension to it. And again, you have the quote, "We love our neighbor insofar as she, too, may share in God's fellowship and beatitude." Take a handout there, please. Now, the aspect, this is, I think you have this quotation, yeah. The aspect under which our neighbor is to be loved is God. Since what we ought to love in our neighbors is that they may be in God. So that's the sort of eschatological dimension, what they may become. Hence it is clear that it is specifically the same act whereby we love God and whereby we love our neighbors. Consequently, the habit of charity extends not only to the love of God, but also to the love of our neighbors. So love of God is the cause of and includes love of neighbor as its effect. Now, this extends to love of enemies, which would not otherwise be possible, because we have precious little in common with our enemies, aside from a shared humanity, and there is no mutuality or even basic liking of our enemies. So, this is why Thomas considers the command to love our enemies, insofar as they are our enemies, positively perverse. Perversum. Strong language indeed. It goes against nature. Of course, Thomas admits that we can love our enemies in a general kind of way, insofar as they are human beings too. But ultimately, it is only charity or love for God that can move us to love our enemy. In that case, we love them because they too have been created in the image of God, are loved by God, and are capable of knowing and loving God. Thomas offers a kind of ordinary analogy to explain this idea. If children of a friend of yours inflict harm upon you, then the very fact that they are the children of your friend will modify and perhaps even mollify your anger towards them. Do you see that? So if you know that your enemy is loved by God, child of God, just like you are, that will change the way you deal with your enemy. Just like when somebody throws in stones in the window of my house, if I know that someone is actually a child of a good friend of mine, that will change the way I deal with the situation. That will change the way I relate to that naughty person throwing stones at my house. Okay? So are you beginning to see how this triangular notion of love works? and how through charity, through love for God, we can begin to love our enemy. Thomas's triangular understanding of love does not imply that he adopts, I should say, a radical agapeic universalist non-preferential understanding of love. Certainly not when it comes to love for neighbor. So when he raises the question whether we ought to love one neighbor more than another, he begins his response by saying that there have been two opinions on this question. And the first opinion, which is the universalist one, or the non-preferential one, or the agapeic one, states that we should love all our neighbors equally as regards the affection we feel for them, but not in the outward effects. So in other words, this is an understanding of love by which I should, for instance, love all children in the world equally, but I might give more money to my children or the children next door than to the children in the global south. But in principle, I should love all children in the world equally. Thomas considers this view unreasonable. Plain English, it's bonkers, he says. Charity is from God, but it is we who love with charity. So there are basically two principles, God and we ourselves. And of course, we love those who are nearer to God, but we also love those who are nearer to us. It's perfectly all right to love your own children more than the children of the person next door. So Thomas says, even as regards the affection, we ought to love one neighbor more than another. Okay? So kinship preference, for instance, is important to Thomas and is perfectly acceptable. It's even a good thing. Right. So far, I've explained something about the triangular nature of love. We have to love others for the sake of God, and this also allows us to love our enemies. Now I want to say a few words about gratuity and non-instrumentality. Ask yourself, why do you love, assuming you have a partner or girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, wife, why do you love her or him? Can you come up with certain answers? You don't have to tell me. But any answer you give might be a wrong one. If your girlfriend asks you, why do you love me? And you say, oh, because you're funny and you're good looking and maybe you're wise, that would be a good answer. But, you know, at the end of the day, these answers mightn't be quite right. What if she's no longer beautiful in 30, 40, 50 years? Right? So people don't want to be loved for certain reasons. People want to be loved in their own right. So that brings me to the gratuitous, non-calculating nature of charity as friendship. Again, you have a quotation there. When discussing the love of angels for God, Thomas remarks that it is an essential feature of love that even though it may have delights and useful benefits associated with it, the gaze of the lover does not regard these benefits, but rather the beloved good. Or again, in his commentary on the sentences, when considering whether love of God permits consideration of a wage, i.e. a reward to which one is entitled, Thomas argues that setting up some wage as the end of love contradicts the definition of friendship. Charity cannot have an eye to a wage, for this would be to set up as the ultimate end not God, but the goods that derive from him. This is, by the way, a key idea that runs throughout the mystical tradition in Christianity. You find it in Bernd of Clairvaux, you find it in the Rhineland mystics, Eckhart, Rusbrook, and others. If you answer the question, why do you love God, by saying, oh, well, because God is a source of consolation to me, then Bernard, for instance, says, maybe you love the consolation more than you love God. And Meister Eckhart says something similar. You have to live and love without a why, without a reason. Ultimately, Meister Eckhart says you cannot give ultimate reasons as to why you love. Thomas goes some way towards agreeing with this. I'll skip a bit. Yeah. The claim that it is our love for God that shores up a gratuitous disposition towards things created is profoundly at odds with our contemporary outlook. Let me try and explain this. First, I will discuss the gratuitous, non-instrumentalist nature implied in Thomas's account of charity by referring to Augustine's distinction between frui and uti. Frui means enjoyment, uti means use. And Augustine had basically argued, and this is going to sound awful, really. Augustine had argued that only God is to be enjoyed, and all things, created things, are to be used. Now that sounds like straightforward instrumentalization, right? Where you treat something that is of value in its own right as a means to an end. But that's not what Augustine means. What Augustine means basically is that only God should be your ultimate concern. If something else is your ultimate concern, take a handout, please. If something else is your ultimate concern, let's say the nation, or power, or money, or pleasure, then your life is going to go off the rails. That is idolatry. So that is what Augustine is trying to say when he says only God should be enjoyed. He means by this only God should be your ultimate concern. If you take the nation or power or money or your local football club and you feel that is what your life is about, then your life is going to go off the rails. Okay? So to treat anything created as your ultimate concern is to be guilty of idolatry. To claim, therefore, as Augustine does, that only God is to be enjoyed is not to imply that created beings, including other people, do not have intrinsic value. On the contrary, Augustine suggests that just because we relate to God as our ultimate concern, we can actually attribute intrinsic value to others. So he's, in a sense, Augustine, and Thomas follows him, is turning the modern critique completely on its head. The modern critique basically says, if you love your neighbor for God's sake, for the sake of God, then you're not really loving your neighbor, right? It's just a medium that you go through, so to speak. On the contrary, Augustine says, if you love God, you can actually treat other people and our environment, I should add, with the reverence that is due to them without abusing them. Let me try and explain this further. So according to Thomas, it's not incoherent to say that we have to love our fellow human beings for God's sake and yet in their own right. And that is, tellingly, the exact opposite of the popular modern view, popularized by Nietzsche, for instance, that the Christian focus upon God and afterlife constitutes a betrayal of this world. So how can Thomas, and Augustine before him, suggest that loving things for the sake of God does not imply their instrumentalization? Or more positively, how can this theocentric focus, sort of anchoring your life in God, safeguard or even establish a gratuitous, non-instrumentalist disposition towards the things of this world? Before I go any further, are we clear on what instrumentalization means? I'll give the example of friendship later, but when you're friends with somebody, that person will probably assist you in many different ways. And that's what friends do. They assist each other. So friendship comes with benefits, with advantages, right? But if you were to target, if you are friends with somebody because of those advantages, you're no longer acting as a friend. You're instrumentalizing the friendship. The friendship becomes a means to an end, whereas friendship really and truly has to be something that is valuable in its own right. Okay? So that is what I mean by this gratuitous and non-instrumental approach, right? You have to value things in their own right and not treat them as a means to an end. And that also applies to, obviously, our love for God. It applies to love of neighbor. So, what happens if we get rid of this bit and we target created things directly? Well, there's two things that can happen. Well, at least two things. If human desire and its infinite dynamic targets created things directly, without the triangulation, if you like, there are two dangers. First of all, there is the danger of tedium, disenchantment, or lack of fulfillment. The pursuit of riches is an example that Thomas gives of a kind of deceptive, merely horizontal infinity, in which we always need more material things because they fail to bring us fulfillment. So Thomas says that our desire for wealth almost has an infinite dynamic, just like our desire for God. But this kind of infinite desire for wealth differs from the desire for God, which succeeds in fulfilling us when it is possessed. On your handout you'll find a quotation, I think, from John 4:13. Whoever drinks of this water, by which temporal goods are signified, shall thirst again. The reason for this is that we realize more their insufficiency when we possess them. And this very fact shows that they are imperfect, and that the sovereign good, which is God, does not consist therein. So when we possess riches, we realize that they fail to fulfill us, and we seek more. So desire for wealth leads to a bad infinity, a never-ending search for more wealth, as it fails to grant fulfillment. And I'm going to draw an analogy here. You could compare this to the behavior of a womanizer. A womanizer who goes from one woman to another, and once he's possessed her, he moves on. But he's not really interested in any of them in particular, okay? So that's one way of relating to the world. It's a tedium, really. Now there's a second improper way of relating to things created. So again, without reference to God, an immediate, direct relating to the world. So one is tedium. The other one occurs when our desire zooms in on a specific created good and invests it with its infinite dynamic. So to pursue the analogy, this is a kind of infatuation, which is very different from the womanizer. Thomas considers it a kind of a superstition, where divine worship is offered to whom it ought not, or even, in the broader sense of the word, idolatry, the gravest of sins. So in idolatry, our desire finds some kind of rest in something finite that becomes the exclusive focus of our will. So given the almost inexhaustible dynamic of human desire, there's always the danger that human desire rests in a finite object which, so to speak, cannot support this burden or intensity. And then we end up idolizing something finite. I mean, you can give 1,001 examples. What do people idolize? What do they turn into their God? I've mentioned them already. Money, power, prestige, the nation, and so on and so forth. For a lot of people, that is effectively their God. That is the ultimate focus of their life. Idolatry. So on the purely immanent plane, without a theocentric focus to direct our lives, we're all too often faced with the reality of idolatry and inevitable disenchantment, disappointment, or even subjection, or alternatively, tedium in the never-ending pursuit of things transient and finite that fail to give us ultimate satisfaction. Now, charity, this is my main argument really, charity solves the riddle of human desire by redirecting it towards God. So if your desire directs created things directly, you're in danger of tedium, indifference, idolatry. You can have a handout there. That's right. Charity solves the riddle of human desire by allowing it to maintain its dynamic without, so it's not like Buddhism. This is a big difference with Buddhism. In Buddhism, desire is extinguished. That's the ideal. Christianity doesn't teach that. Christianity says you have to maintain your desire, but it has to have a theocentric focus. It has to be redirected towards God. So, charity solves the riddle of human desire by allowing it to maintain its dynamic without, however, pursuing a bad infinity, wandering from one particular created thing to another in a futile quest for fulfillment in this life. So to continue our analogy, we can compare this to marriage. So we had the womanizer, we had infatuation. Marriage, at least in a religious sense, as distinct from the secular understanding, is not a mere contract between spouses who commit themselves to meeting mutual obligations and support. Instead, the couple invokes God when making their vows. That is, God is the middle person. So the couple takes a vow before God. That's how a religious marriage is something very different from a purely secular marriage, which is basically a contract between two people. So it is God's eternity that secures and renders these vows ultimately meaningful. Through the theocentricity of charity, our desire for created things is not abolished, but our desire for them is now mediated through God. And it is exactly this refocusing that redeems the way we relate to things. Through charity, which reorients our desire for created things through God, Deo mediante, we can actually attribute intrinsic value to things. And as I've said, if our desire directly targets created things, we're in danger of idolizing them or turning away from them with tedium. When our desire focuses on God first, these things can be enjoyed for what they are, valuable and perhaps beautiful, but not God. I've stated the claim, but I haven't really explained it. So again, I would like to draw an analogy. And I've mentioned it earlier. Friendship comes undoubtedly with a set of advantages, such as mutual support and assistance. If, however, I immediately target those advantages, I'm no longer acting as a friend. Are you familiar with the concept of the social networker? The sort of person who uses friendship in order to get places, in order to self-promote. Sort of the person on cocktail parties who goes from one to the other. Yeah, do you know the type? I don't like it. It is by being a genuine friend, without focusing on the advantages of friendship, that I can truly enjoy the benefits of friendship. That is, indirectly. Social networkers do not relate properly to the benefits that are associated with friendship if they pursue or desire them immediately. And this is why they end up instrumentalizing the friendship. Friendship is something that is valuable in its own right, but they are using it as a means to an end. So we can only genuinely relish the benefits of friendship by acting as a true friend and love our friend for her own sake in a gratuitous manner. so too with our relation to created things. If we love them through God, we can truly relish them. If we target them immediately, we are in danger of relating to them in an improper manner. So I hope that's a useful analogy between friendship on the one hand, friendship and social network on the one hand, and charity that loves created things through God, i.e. indirectly. Just like a friend should not directly target the advantages that come with friendship, but only by being a friend, i.e. indirectly. I hope that's a useful analogy because Thomas, of course, as you have learned, characterizes charity itself in terms of friendship with God. So what I'm trying to make clear is that charity extends the gratuity or non-instrumentality at the heart of any genuine friendship by infusing all our desires and pursuits with a radical theocentricity. I think this is a powerful message for today, in which processes of instrumentalization and monetarization intrude upon central areas of cultural reproduction, education, art, and even interpersonal relations. Why do you study? It's a very interesting question. Why are you here? Why are you getting a degree? If that's your answer, then you're instrumentalizing education, obviously. And I know you're not serious. You're instrumentalizing education. I mean, what you really should do is you should really enjoy your education in its own right. And if you're doing theology and philosophy, by God, if you can't enjoy that in its own right, then please do something else. Okay? So you have to enjoy education in its own right, and that applies to any education, mathematics, for instance, right? Which I know nothing about. But if you study mathematics for the sake of its uses and its applications, you're never going to become a good mathematician. It's only by enjoying mathematics and engaging with it for the fun of it, and apparently there are people like that who enjoy that sort of thing, then you're going to be able to learn all the applications as well, indirectly, so to speak. Okay? So that's the sort of thing that I think charity actually, in a broad sense, instills in us a disposition of gratuitousness, a disposition of non-instrumentalization. And these days, I'm very sorry to say, education, for instance, with which I'm most familiar with, is being instrumentalized left, right, and center. It becomes an economic product, so to speak. It has to have economic benefits. Students in documents of the Irish government are described as consumers of education. I mean, that is an awful mindset, okay? So education, art, interpersonal relations are all subject to instrumentalization. Whereas some critics are worried, and I'll finish with this, whereas some critics are worried that the notion that we have to love other people or things for the sake of God will result in treating them as a means to an end and thus instrumentalizing them, it is actually the other way around. Just because we love God first and foremost, we can love created things with the reverence that is due to them. As Roger Scruton reminds us, one of the persistent fallacies of modern thinking is the belief that if something is of benefit to us, it is a means to the benefit it confers. That's a very good definition of instrumentalization. Thomas's analysis suggests that love for God enables us to treat the things from which we benefit most, worship of God, art, knowledge, friendship, love of neighbor. So the things from which we benefit most, I've lost my train of thought. Thomas' analysis suggests that love for God enables us to treat the things from which we benefit most as ends in themselves and as inherently valuable. In light of this analysis, one may wonder whether the erosion of religion and the theocentric focus and gratuitousness it has traditionally nurtured has made modern society far more vulnerable to rampant instrumentalizations in all areas of life, such as human relations, education, healthcare, and so on. Thank you very much for your attention.